The title is Methodology, which may sound a little tedious, but talking with Ned and Roman, I understand actually it's theory, and of course that's the queen, the unifying theme, so we're looking forward to what Ned Phelps has to say. Everyone, of course, knows Ned, and everyone knows Roman also, but at least I should say, since he's a visitor from NYU, a professor of economics at NYU. Ned?
Thank you, Merritt. Thank you very much. I'm probably weighing in at 16 minutes, so I'll try to move it along as fast as is prudent. Two themes on economics and Trump. First, economics cannot solve for the path of America's economy under Trumpian policy, or even the change of path that will result. But I do think that Trumpian policy is dangerous, and I will discuss that. Second theme, Trump's thinking about the economy is based on poor economic models, so I'm apprehensive about the consequences of those policies. I begin with the latter theme, Trump's thinking in the economy. I think that Trump has relied on some Keynesian beliefs he may have picked up at Wharton in the 1960s. Larry Klein, you know those people? You're too young. Beliefs, many of which Keynes himself rejected by the end of his life. We see that Keynesian perspective at work when Trump says that the large excess of our imports over our exports siphons away some of the aggregate demand for domestic output, for the GDP. This tenet of Trump's is reminiscent of the famous theme of Raul Prebisch, the influential Argentine economist of the 40s and 50s, sometimes called Latin America's Keynes. He thought that what he termed import substitution diverted Latin American economies from the development of manufacturing and a high level of investment, which was why Latin America remained poor. Another tenet of Trump's is also Keynesian, the belief that output and employment are pulled up by fiscal stimulus. While Trump and Secretary Mnuchin were not explicit, they left it to others to say that the personal income tax cuts in high and low brackets would generally boost consumer demand, and the cuts in corporate profits taxes would boost investment demand. That same belief was held by those policymakers in the West who maintained that fiscal stimulus, more public spending and tax reduction pulled employment from the depths of the Great Recession, and a policy of fiscal austerity, a pretty tight rein on public spending, and little in the way of tax cuts, prevented or slowed recovery. But is this belief true? I began to wonder 2 years ago. Did countries where fiscal deficits in the years after they hit bottom, that were relatively big deficits, as measured by the increase of public debt from 2011 to 2017, normalized by the level of GDP, proved to have relatively speedy recovery of employment, or not? The evidence in Figure 1, is that it? The evidence in Figure 1, where am I? Okay, does not support that. The relationship, if there is one, is negative. Perhaps the fiscal profligacy in Spain, Portugal, and Italy got in the way of recovery. How about that, Keynesians? Just kidding, I love you.
Charlie's not here to respond.
How could this be? I would argue that when an economy, upon bottoming out, finds itself already mired in a swollen public debt, it will face a worse fiscal drag the larger the deficit is that it chooses to run in subsequent years. First, some evidence. Consider the post-war economic crisis before the Great Recession. What is the first post-war economic crisis? Well, it was when the returnees from the war drove the civilian labor force from 53.9 million in 1945 to 60.2 million in 1947. Imagine that. Suddenly, the economy was inundated with returnees from the war. Keynesians, such as Leon Kaiserling, said extending the wartime fiscal deficits would avert a return to the Depression. But the federal government, under President Harry Truman, ran fiscal surpluses over his 8 years in office. What happened? In that span, the unemployment rate went down, and the labor force participation rate went up from 1952, from 1946 to 1952. Okay, that's evidence. Now, a little theory. Assume that the economy, while at equilibrium, or something, while at an equilibrium level of employment, equilibrium in every respect you can think of, is hit by a helicopter drop of public debt that falls into the hands of the public, and the government raises tax rates to service the added debt. It's just a story, it doesn't have to be realistic. Households feeling more liquid may raise aggregate demand until prices rise and their liquid savings run low, as Keynesians might suggest. But there will also be a contraction of aggregate supply as marginal tax rates on wages and on profits reduce incentives to work and to invest, which will contract output and employment. Trump just doesn't realize the cost of that public debt that he is running up. And I'm afraid many of the economists also don't get it. Another possibility is that the effect of a country's fiscal stimulus is diffused over the global economy, so that a country feels little or nothing of the stimulus. When I taught undergraduate macroeconomics decades ago, I enjoyed drawing on the blackboard a rising LM curve, looks like that, and in the output interest rate plane, and a rising LM curve, and then slicing through that a horizontal line whose height is given by the world real rate of interest, which we always called R star. The intersection of this horizontal line with that rising curve in the diagram that determines output. Now, what about fiscal stimulus? Well, in that system, fiscal stimulus neither raises the real interest rate, the world real interest rate, of course it doesn't do that, nor does it shift out the LM curve. It's an IS curve that's being shifted, not the LM curve, but by fiscal stimulus. So where does the stimulus go, as Bob Mendel used to amuse himself by asking people? And he'd say, giggling, it goes abroad. It goes overseas. Only a negligible part of it stays at home. So that's the heart of Robert Mundell's early work. Rudy Dornbush later built another model of demand spilling out. Some theorists of employment determination put their emphasis on monetary policy, not fiscal policy. James Tobin, who taught me advanced macro, built a Keynesian model in which fiscal policy does not affect employment, and that's not all. But monetary policy, the supply of money or the cost of money in relation to the return on capital, does. But has monetary stimulus been effective? It's an empirical question. Maybe the entirety of the Keynesian edifice, not only the fiscal stimulus, but the monetary stimulus, is flawed and undependable, to understate the situation. So I got to worrying again. What happened to my figure one? Oh, it's up. Oh. Now can we go back to figure one? Because I missed it. Thanks. Thank goodness the audience didn't miss it. Okay, so you see there that fiscal stimulus, it's not true that the countries with the big fiscal stimulus got the faster recovery. Just the opposite. Now let's go to figure two. So I got to wondering, did countries where monetary stimulus in the years after they hit bottom was relatively strong, measured by the quantity of monetary assets purchased by the central bank between 2011 and 2017, did that monetary stimulus prove to promote a relatively speedy recovery? Well, figure two does not support that belief either. So if both fiscal and monetary stimulus were pretty much ineffective, what was driving the relatively speedy recoveries? One possibility draws on Keynes's early insight. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in March 1933, amid radical ideas in response to the Deep Depression, Keynes warned Roosevelt to beware of policies that might cause a loss of business confidence. Perhaps Portugal, Italy, and Greece are having slow, if not stunted, recoveries, in large part because their fiscal profligacy has devastated business confidence. Iceland, it is said, recovered rapidly because it maintained the confidence of international investors. Gylfi Zweig is here to tell us about Iceland. But I suspect there's another explanation for these statistical results. It may be that a nation with a relatively high level of dynamism, a nation overflowing with ideas for new products or methods and widespread zeal to develop and market them, would be quick to take advantage of empty shops, closed plants, and discharged workers who haven't found a job yet. So from that perspective, we can expect that the relatively dynamic economies, the US, I would hope, still the US, and the UK come to mind, but also Sweden and to a degree, Germany. So we can expect those countries to achieve a relatively rapid recovery, regardless of the stimulus, or even in spite of the stimuli. So let's test this theory. Now, before I get to the figure, of course, we're not sure there is much dynamism left in those high flyers of the West's glorious past. As my book, Mass Flourishing, maintains, innovation has declined in nations where it had been strong, though in the U.S. it rose in a narrow set of new industries, leaving a net slowdown of American innovation. Figure 3, so with regard to testing the importance of dynamism, Figure 3 shows a strong statistical relationship between this proxy for dynamism, and thus for innovation, and the speed of recovery. These results suggest that fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus are at best sideshows, that the main driver of recovery is dynamism, the same dynamism that drives everything good, from wage growth to job satisfaction and life satisfaction. So in explaining America's recovery and now its modest boom, I would give a lot of credit to American enterprise and what's left of its innovation, and give no credit, little or no credit, to stimulus. So I can't go along with the economists who say that the data are showing that Trump's medicine is working. Now, on to my second theme, with little time left. What can economists or those from other disciplines infer will be the consequences of Trumpian policy for working-age people in America? I view America as having had an economy in which large numbers of people are continuously conceiving and developing new products or methods, and the governments are constantly conceiving and developing new public goods and public services. For me, this was the good economy, though it never became the just economy, but it was at least the good economy. Jobs were rewarding. Large numbers of ordinary people reaped the extraordinary experience of using their imagination and exercising their creativity in the course of their work. Even larger numbers of people could have a sense of autonomy. I keep forgetting Richard Sennett's word beginning with A. Agency, that's it. I'm constantly blocking on that word. Large numbers of people could have a sense of agency, of succeeding at something, or perhaps making a difference in the world. And families could have the sense of achievement or advancement from generation to generation. That kind of life, this wonderland which spread over the West after the Napoleonic War, over the 19th century, seems to have gone into some degree of decline some decades ago. Whole communities and regions now have a sense of detachment from the rewards of challenge and achievement. Many of us scholars are desperate to grasp how this decline came about. Perhaps the decline was caused by a growth of materialism, avarice, dishonesty, and more. This decline is simply not addressed by Trumpian theory. It cannot be addressed because, having no idea of what the good economy is, it does not see how much of the good economy has been lost, and does not see the weakening of the values that nourish the good economy. Trump himself shows a total ignorance of such a life and such values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ned.
It's easy.
And on to Roman.
Yeah, I need the slides. Is Lizzie coming in?
Haven't come yet? Where are they coming in from?
Is Lizzie coming?
There we go.
Right. So, so when I say this, you move to the next one. Yeah.
Do you want to switch with me so you can
Okay, so This is a perfect example how the lack of coordination and many decades of talking results in coordination. Because we decided we will not talk about what we will speak about, so every one of us is not influenced by the other, but of course we are influenced by the other anyway. And therefore the session that was completely unprepared to be coordinated actually touches on the very same themes, although I will not talk about fiscal policy. I will talk about the deficit. And I will talk about something that has to do with whether dynamism matters and how this matters for thinking about Trump, but not from this point of view. So what is the task that I've set to myself? It has to do with my thinking about Trump, basically. And what this has to do with is Trump is well known to have been had a great deal of disdain about the experts. And I decided to ask myself a question in connection with this conference that Ned organized and the methodology panel that I was participating in. I decided to ask myself two questions. The first one is, how did the economics profession respond to Trump's irrationality? And the second issue, how we can rationally assess consequences of his policies. It's a very difficult topic because I was very worried about coming across as saying that there's something about the economists that Trump shares, because I don't believe that, although there is perhaps something. And so let me start with these two issues, and then I'll tell you about something practical at the end that I found sort of intriguing, at least. So the talk is in 3 parts, like a little play, everyone 5 minutes. So the first one is Trump speaking and his officials. The second part is economists speaking. And the third part is my humble self speaking. So let's start with Trump. During one of his campaign rallies on April, I'm going to read because I want to make sure that I don't move extemporaneously given the time. There's a lot to talk about. We can talk about it for a day. During one of his campaign rallies on April 4th, 2016, Trump revealed his disdain for those on whom our society relies to gather and interpret the facts that serve as crucial input to democratic discourse and policy making. He declared that, I can't do his accent, I wish I could. You know, I've always wanted to say this. I've never said this before with all the talking that we all do. All of these experts, we need an expert. The experts are terrible. In the period since the election, it has become a cliche that as president, Trump is pursuing with astonishing zeal an effort to reshape our public discourse and policy making to confirm to his belief that expertise based on reasoned interpretation of facts is fake news. What is important for my talk is that he declares to his infatuated supporters to replace rational thinking with his alternative facts and his true interpretations of them. So, being a good monarch, his administration obliges and follows the monarch's line. So administration's officials have followed Trump in pronouncing on the true consequences, quote unquote, of the policies that they propose. Nowhere has this been more evident than in the Secretary Mnuchin's often quoted assertions, as reported by the New York Times on November 30, 2017, I quote, "The $1.5 trillion tax overhaul will pay for itself through a surge of economic growth, and that 100 people in Treasury are working around the clock on running scenarios for us." In the event, the Treasury produced no analysis of the impact of tax overhaul on the fiscal deficit. Mnuchin's often repeated pronouncements that the tax bill will pay for itself have turned out to be another attempt to exploit the well-worn propaganda practice that repeating an unfounded assertion will turn into truth. By the way, this is my comment on the graphs that Charles Colomiris presented about the business community optimism being picked up after Trump's election. Economists, both of those supporting and opposing the administration's plan, have injected now the second act, have injected some rationality into the tax debate. They've done so by producing precise projections of the efforts of the bill on economic growth and discussing those projections in ways accessible to the broader public in a series of commentaries prepared for Project Syndicate. This debate exemplifies, and this is where we parallel with Ned almost completely because it so happens that it's also about growth, the current approach to economic analysis of the consequences of policy initiatives such as the tax bill. To carry out such analysis, economists typically rely on standard macroeconomic models. Again, unfortunately, University of Pennsylvania, but that is because Trump went there, such as the stochastic Penn-Wharton overlapping generations model. Like any economic model, these models formalize an economist's understanding of the growth process. Because the economist's understanding of this process summarizes the accumulative wealth of empirical evidence and theoretical insight, standard macroeconomic models are indeed based on what we usually refer to as rational considerations. They're based on reason, they're based on facts. But there's a catch. The catch is, as Ned and I pointed out in our recent op-ed, like other standard macroeconomic models, the growth models rest on the core premise that the consequences of the tax changes can be characterized precisely as a random deviation around the deterministic growth path over a period as long as 10 years. But as Karl Popper pointed out a long time ago, what the standard models cannot account for is, as he put it, the future is open, it is objectively open. And yet standard macroeconomic models assume that the future is objectively closed. They dispense with what Frank Knight referred to almost a century ago as, I quote, true uncertainty. This uncertainty arises from unforeseeable change, in good part in this case coming from the path that dynamism and creativity will take, to connect to Ned's talk, which might define as change that cannot be characterized in advance with probabilistic rules. So one cannot in advance say whether somebody will invent yet another iPad and put a probability on it. One cannot yet say whether somebody will invent another way to organize a factory floor and put a probability on it. The consequences of historical events, such as the $1.5 trillion tax cut, are clearly unforeseeable in Knight's sense. At the time the bill was enacted, there was simply no past data to specify a stochastic model that would predict ex ante the timing and impact of the tax changes on the economy's growth path. Neither Treasury economists nor anyone else could have predicted precisely the future consequences of the tax bill. Yet, as I said, both the proponents and opponents of the bill were doing exactly that, and of course coming up with the exactly opposite conclusions. We have no time to go into how you can get the opposite conclusion. But there's one thing they did agree on, that nothing unforeseeable will ever happen, both the proponents and the opponents. So now, what are the implications of this for understanding where we are and then taking us just a step further? I just want to make one point, which is in the next slide, which I go over quickly. Once an economist assumes that he can represent the growth process precisely, he can, of course, compute the consequences of the tax bill precisely. Importantly, such predictions are rational in a much stronger sense than being based on reasoning and understanding. In my recent work with my Danish colleagues, I showed that whenever an economist formulates a model that assumes away Knightian and true uncertainty, and this is the key, he has no option but to assert that his no understanding of the process, his own rationality, represents precisely how every rational individual understands and forecasts outcomes. In the context of the analysis of the consequences of tax overhaul, this assertion takes a striking form. By assuming away unforeseeable change, The standard growth models hypothesize that future political developments will not lead to a reversal of the tax law's major provisions. Remarkably, these models also assume that the economy's participants are rational in how they make consumption, investment, and other decisions, which presumably gives these models legitimacy. They will, just like economists, assume that tax changes will remain virtually intact as the law of the land into foreseeable future. However, once we introduce unforeseeable change, it's not something we're going to do here, we can actually build formal models that recognize that rational individuals' understanding of their economy is different from economists' understanding. This would enable economic analysis to recognize that the future is objectively open and that rational individuals will devise diverse ways to understand it and to deal with it through creativity, through their dynamic activities, through the rest of it. So now you think I've gone so far away from where we are, then I need to come back now. So now the attempt to come back. So that's the last act. Does this methodological discussion make any difference for how we can analyze the economic consequences of Mr. Trump? I'll take something very prosaic, although it has other broad implications for macro policy and many other things, regulation. I want to sketch how recognizing that economies face neither uncertainty and that market participants have autonomous understanding of the future. It's amazing that you use that term, Ned. Autonomous understanding of the future. If they have agency, now I have to give it to Richard.
Three of us.
Right. That if they have autonomous understanding of the future political, opens a new way, a new path to interpreting the consequences of Trump for future stock price movement. Something as prosaic as this. And I was actually quite surprised when I looked at these numbers. I will hasten to add that this is extremely preliminary. This can all be done formally, but of course I will not do that here. So let's go to nuts and bolts and get that table with the stock prices, right? So a commonly used metric to assess whether equity prices are too high or that the market is thus close to reversal relies on the price-earning ratio. So this table shows two different price-earning ratios. In one of the columns, the 10-year price-earning ratio is the stock price divided by the 10-year average of earnings, of corporate earnings. In real terms, the data come from Bob Schiller's really authoritative data set. And there's a 12-month PE. The difference between these numbers is large, and I need to say a word about where the difference comes from. If you take a 10-year PE ratio, then you basically are looking, in rough sense, at the distribution of income over the last 10 years. So if you have a growing inequality, then the denominator here will be much lower. And therefore, the current price divided by a price-earning ratio will be much higher. If you look at the 12-month P ratio, then as long as prices move sort of with earnings, you're going to get different numbers. So what do we see here? That parallels some of the things that Angus Deaton was getting at actually at lunch. A 10-year PE ratio has dramatically increased since the beginning of the second term of the Obama presidency. What does that mean? That means that the inequality in the United States has not started with Trump. It started in 2010. There's been a corporate earnings rose nearly 70% during the 2010-2015 period of Obama's presidency. And the sharp increase, of course, resumed with Trump, with the earnings rising nearly 20% over the 18-month periods from November 16 to March 18. At the same time, that's important, interest rates rose during Obama's second term. The 12-month ratio shows the same tendency, though the increase is much more moderate. So what do these points suggest? They suggest, you see, if, roughly speaking, if earnings move up with prices or prices move with earnings, that there's no autonomous effect. There is no expectational effect, because the rest is sort of, roughly speaking, an expectational effect. So if the price-earning ratio moves up, that means that there's an additional element to earnings that moves prices up, and that's particularly true if the interest rates actually are increasing, which they are from about 2012. So then there's no doubt almost that it's an expectational effect. So then the next question is, where does this expectational effect come from? In a standard economic model, it should come from just earnings, but you already see it's not going to do. So it has to come from somewhere else. But where is that somewhere else? Behavioral economists would say psychology, and I would look to politics. So that's what I want to do next. Okay? So the question I want to ask in my last two slides is, does this admittedly cursory look at the evidence, and I stress it's admittedly cursory, indicate that we are in the middle of a Trump boom, in the sense that the election of Trump provided a strong positive boost to the market's optimism? The short answer to that is that it's too early to say, because so far Trump has not matched anywhere near the distributive tendencies of the Obama years. He's nowhere near. If he continues, he might actually do that. So what does it say about the future movements? Well, the future movements are really interesting. Let's keep the table on the time. The 10-year P ratio is very high, 32. Note that we just had an anniversary of the Lehman. It was 20 just before the onset of the financial crisis. 32 is a big number. That's a big number. The 12-month ratio stands only at around 25. Given the expected interest in interest rates, our framework suggests two contingent predictions in a sense of Karl Popper. That's for another time. So one contingent prediction is this. The economy will return to the earlier, less unequal distribution of income, likely triggering the market's decline unless interest rates decline, which is unlikely. Regressive policies and stagnation in wage growth will continue, thereby sustaining the bull market even in the face of higher interest rates. What is interesting about it is that at the moment, the market participants seem to forecast the continuation of the regressive tendencies that began in the Obama era, even if Democrats gain the upper hand electorally. The market doesn't seem to be much worried about the Democrats winning. So now we go to the last slide. So where does this leave us? So here's where I just want to reflect a little more broadly for a minute. The contingency of these predictions for my discussion about the debate regarding the impact of tax changes. It's clear. I mean, it connects clearly with what Ned said. You can't talk about growth in a model in which the economist tells you where the growth path is going to be as a random deviation around the deterministic path. It omits everything that was on those graphs that Ned was looking at. Just about everything that growth may. So then if that model tells you whether it's fiscal or monetary policy, it may indeed be fiscal or monetary policy, but you have absolutely no basis to even state that, let alone whether it is. So that's the first point. So that's how it connects. The second thing actually connects with the next session in a very clear way. I just argued against exact predictions, but Ned, by putting these two sessions together and by the surreptitious event that I didn't have the slides I speak next, actually connected what we do with the next session. The next session is about structural change. And to predict the future exactly, one would have to talk about the change in Trump's policies in probabilistic terms. And so while I'm sure the next session will agree that there's structural change, I'm sure everyone would agree that this cannot be put in probabilistic terms because we have no prior data. That's one of the things that is obvious about Trump. We have no prior data for the world in which we have entered. It illustrates the peril of relying on models that assume that we can deliver precise predictions regarding the consequences of the policies, such as the $1.5 trillion tax overhaul, whether we like the bill because we're Democrats or whether because we're Republicans, or we don't like the bill because we're Democrats. So what is the consequence of this precision for the public interest and for the public debate, which is what I want to end with. And that's basically why I prepared this talk. The precision promised by such predictions will inevitably be followed by their eventual inaccuracy. owing precisely to dynamism, unforeseeable change, variety of things. And what does it contribute to? It contributes to the public's impression that economists, who after all, I want to emphasize this, have considerable knowledge and expertise about the way the economy works, that their knowledge is of limited use in informing public debate. It almost accidentally, although I hate to say this, may in the eyes of an educated public, they may conclude that maybe Mnuchin, who didn't want to compute this because he's a complete ignorant, maybe that wasn't so crazy that he didn't want to compute it. This is exactly what the demagogues exploit. They exploit such demonstrably false impression to disguise their ignorance as truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron.